And we are live. Thank you, dearest listener, for joining us today. My name is Jason, and just to tell you quickly what's about to happen, I work in a company that provides software development to other companies here in Israel and also in England. And because of my role in business development, I have been very fortunate to meet some amazing, innovative, successful thought leaders, CEOs, and top performers. And what we try and do here on this podcast is we try and tease out, we try and draw out of our listeners their habits, their tools, their strategies, what they've done in order to achieve their success. And of course, our goal is to give our listeners, our dearest listeners, both people in the top management and also people that are working to become top performers. We give them these tips, these tools, these strategies in order to help these individuals achieve their goals. And with us today, I have the extreme pleasure of bringing onto the show one of my personal favorite teachers from IDC, the Interdisciplinary Centre here in Israel in Herzliya. And it just speaks to the testament of how amazing IDC is, the education that years after school, I still have a connection with Professor Orly Idan. Thank you, Professor, for being on this podcast and sharing today some amazing knowledge that you've gained from your skills and from your studies.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Jason.
So, I mean, the first question I would want to ask you is, as a professor, is how did you become interested in academia before we go into actually what you do?
Okay. Well, it's actually an easy question to answer because ever since, I can remember myself, I've always wanted to be in academia. Like as a child, I read books about all sorts of personas in university campuses, and also amazing scientists, especially female scientists, Marie Curie and such, and her daughter, and etc. And I was fascinated, and I liked to read. I liked to visit laboratories. So I knew that this is what I was going to do. I didn't know in what area yet, but I did know that I was going to be a researcher.
You are very lucky. I feel like a lot of people don't know what their life calling is, and you were lucky to find out that you loved academia so much. So let me ask you, where did you get your PhD, and how did you become interested in language?
Well, that's also an easy question to answer. I grew up in several countries. I moved every 3-4 years to another country. From the day I was born until basically I chose to come to Israel and serve in the army. Wow. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me that question. I'm joking, of course. And so I moved from country to country, and I naturally acquired the languages of each country. So, German, and then Swiss, and German, and Swedish, and French, and obviously English, and so on. And I loved languages. I was fascinated by languages, not only the language itself, but also what it represents, the culture, the society. And there was actually a point when I thought I was going to be a translator in the United Nations. It was like a romantic dream, but it didn't stay for long. And so I was really fascinated by languages also from a very young age.
That's incredible. So I think I counted there 6 languages. You must have such an interesting way of thinking because you can think in so many different languages.
Well, I must say that I'm not fluent in all of the languages that I mentioned. But yes, I think that we know today from research that there are several advantages to knowing more than one language, and more than 2, and more than 3, and more than 4. The more the merrier. Basically, I would say that, well, I would say 2 things.
Mhm.
And that already has to do with the specific area that I'm in. So maybe I'll say one thing now, that
Cool.
knowing more than one language is not only good for our cognitive abilities. I mean, the brain loves it. The brain loves languages, not only us. And it's to our advantage as children. Apparently, it enhances our executive functioning, or in other words, the way that we can, I would say, carry out simultaneous tasks and all sorts of cognitive functions that are at a higher level than, I would say, the normative ones. So research has shown that it's very good for it's bilingual children are strong in that area, stronger than monolingual. And this advantage carries on through our entire life as adults, and even as elderly adults. It lowers the risks of Alzheimer and dementia. So yes, go and study languages.
That's amazing. So you're saying that if someone has a child, to teach the child an extra language when they are younger will help throughout their life in their cognitive abilities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's this myth that uh, bilingual children are late talkers, and that they develop slowly in terms of the language because they're hearing two separate systems, if you like, at the same time. And actually it's the opposite. If one parent channels one language and another parent channels another, um, then it's just an advantage for the child, because basically, the child doesn't know that these are two separate systems. For the child, it's one. It's actually in the brain. It's channeled into one area, and only at the age of 3 approximately does the child realize that these are two separate systems and can actually start translating and playing around with it. And this is definitely to the child's advantage, no doubt.
That's amazing. So the child only sees it as one thing. Just like when I learned Hebrew, I had to learn Hebrew from scratch when I came to Israel, and I obviously knew the difference between English and Hebrew. And when I was learning things like uh, feminine and masculine in the Hebrew language, it was like a completely new paradigm for me that I had to get my head around.
That's
Um,
right. It doesn't exist in English. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that really brings us to your area of expertise, which is psycholinguistics. And that's the course that I took with you and still remember so much of. And that's what hopefully we're going to dive into, psycholinguistics and the workplace. But before we do, could you give us a bit of a background about what psycholinguistics is?
Sure, sure. Many people hear this term psycholinguistics and look at me in a very strange way, and I tell them that it's not a rare tropical plant or something like that. It's actually a field of study made, well, the name is comprised of two disciplines, psychology clearly, and linguistics, which is the study of language. But actually, psycholinguistics covers much more than psychology and linguistics. Anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, linguists, neuroscientists, neuropsycholinguists, all of these professions are interested in the study of language. And if I have to define the term in one or two sentences, I would say that psycholinguistics is or studies the relationship between language and thought, language and the mind. Or in other words, to what extent, or not to what extent, how does language influence, shape, produce, mold, create our perceptions, our thoughts, our ideas, and even, I dare say, our emotions. Or, in other words, the fact that we are in constant dialogue with ourselves. The listeners are now thinking that this may be interesting, and I've never heard of this before, and I'd like to read some articles about it. And all this is happening in the listeners' minds while they are in dialogue with themselves. Basically, all of us are talking to ourselves 24 hours a day, even in our dreams. So we are constantly using words and language in order to, and combining them in order to create coherent sentences, i.e. ideas. And we are constantly using language in order to think. Basically, if I want to be really dramatic, then I'll say that without language, we could not think. This is definitely one school of thought, which I totally adhere to. Without language, we cannot think. And if I want to take it, if I wanted to relate it to the previous question that you asked, or that I started to answer about bilingual or multilingual people, I would also say that if language and the words that we know actually are a tool for thinking, then the more languages we know, the broader our scope of thought. The more languages we know, the broader our ability is to think and design and create and etc. and be innovative. So definitely that's another reason to go and study languages. The more the merrier.
That's incredible. So psycholinguistics really compiles so many other different disciplines. And what you're saying is that it's so important to understand language because we even think in language. In other words, we can't get away from it. We can't escape it. Even when we're alone on our own, we're having language. And as you said, language controls our emotions, language controls our thoughts and also our actions. And what I would wonder is there a way to make sure that we are using our language, especially when we're thinking about ourselves, in the correct, proper way to help us move forward? Because I know that language can be dangerous as well, especially if you are using, language that's self-deprecating and, putting yourself down.
Yeah. So language it's very popular to say that language is power, but what does it really mean? What does it really mean? It means first and foremost that we human beings are the strongest living creatures, in the sense that we may not be physically the strong, we aren't physically the strongest, but in the sense that we can reach peaceful and conciliatory negotiations. We can start a war. We can cause people to vote for us. We can do so many things with language that can change the world dramatically, and it does. We use words in order to change, in order to innovate, in order to basically move from one stage to another. And so in that sense, language is really the most powerful tool that human beings have. It's something that is unique to human beings. Animals, they communicate and etc. But human beings are the only creatures that really have this sophisticated innate tool, right? And a universal one at that. So yes, it's very powerful. And also, as you say, for self-help, because we are talking to ourselves all the time, then we can, we can narrate the story the way we like it, right? We can take our lives to where we like it just by telling ourselves the relevant story.
That's incredible. And as you said there, that language is power. And what comes to mind when I think about language is, from all of your studies and from just your life experience, how can we make sure that the language that we use is both effective in our workplace? Because of course this podcast is focused on high performance in the workplace. How can our language improve? How can we improve our language in the workplace, and also just generally in our lives? How can we use language that connects people? How can we use language that that lifts ourselves up and lifts other people up? I know those are two separate questions, but just two things that came to mind for me.
Sure. Well, there's so much to say and so much research done about language in the context of different contexts. the role of language in inducing emotions, the role of language in inducing thoughts. I just said there's so much research. Relative to other domains, there isn't that much. Psycholinguistics is not such an ancient, if you like, or it's not that old in terms of research. In academia, the moment you name a domain, then it becomes something that you are interested in researching. Or basically, it takes one professor to give a name to something that already exists for academia to start being interested in it, especially in psychology. I mean, in psychology, we're not inventing anything, we're identifying it. And the moment you do that, you're actually giving it, this justification, and then it's a field of study. So there is quite a lot of research, but not as much as in other fields, and so there's still a lot to be done. But before we talk about the workplace, I want to give you an example, if it's okay, of how very, very subtle linguistic differences make a huge difference. And I'm telling you about this research just because it's a very nice introduction to talking about language in the workplace. And the idea is that part of our interest as psycholinguists and in general is to try and, as you said, make the world a better place, right? Make everything so much more positive, whether it's home, workplace, and our general environment, not only our small family unit. And research that we did recently, based, of course, on so many other people's work. I'm just I carry on my work based on other people's work, obviously, and so I'm giving this example only because it's very relevant to the Israeli context. And we studied the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we gave Israeli students, Israeli Jewish students, we gave them a list of conciliatory policies. Half of the students, when I say conciliatory policies, maybe I should explain what I mean. In Israel, a conciliatory policy would maybe be considered, and I'm not getting into politics, I'm just stating the way it is, would maybe be considered like a more left-wing type of approach. So for example, I could say something like, dividing Jerusalem is a conciliatory policy, okay? And so I could state in two possible ways, and this is what we did. We had two conditions. We divided this huge bulk of about 1,000 participants in half, and half of the students received sentences like, I am for the division of Jerusalem, where the division of is a noun form, versus I am for dividing Jerusalem, which is a verb. In Hebrew, it's even more distinct, okay? And so it's the same sentence in terms of meaning. Semantically, it has the exact same meaning. The outcome is that Jerusalem will be divided, but the way apparently it is processed in our brain is different. And this is a nuance, and this is a subtle linguistic difference. And I don't know if I'll let you know what our results were because I can't ask anyone what they think here. But we found that nouns had a salutary effect, or in other words, nouns decreased the level of anger the participant had towards this conciliatory policy, and nouns also increased support for this conciliatory policy. And if I approach it from the verb form, then verbs increased anger, and verbs also decreased support for conciliatory policies. And what it actually tells us, oh, and I must say that this was found across the entire political spectrum, whether you're left, right, center, it was found across the board, which is extremely interesting, meaning it works on anyone, no matter what their political ideology is. And I'll just say what this basically means is that when you are talking in verb form, apparently you feel responsible for this action. You feel close to this action in terms of, there's no psychological distance. You can actually see yourself even acting it out. We know this from previous research. And when you're using the noun form, it's very abstract. It's less vivid. It's not necessarily you doing it. You don't even know who's doing it. And there's some sort of distance. It's not happening for us. Perhaps it's not even happening now. So this difference between the noun and the verb form is so subtle, and yet none of us really think of these things. So it's proof of, first of all, how significant language is. And this is an example of how applicable the study of language is, because the only thing I now need to tell, and obviously simplifying it, it's not that easy, but the only thing I can now tell, diplomats and politicians and people that are sitting around the negotiating table is, if you want to cool it down a bit, use nouns.
I wish that right now in the presidential debate from both sides, there's so much hostility. I can feel it. Like we're what's today, the 28th of October, and we're what 7 days away from the elections, and I can it's palpable. I can feel it in the air, the two sides, and whoever is going to lead the country needs to be unified. It needs to be everyone together, unified both sides, and that is totally a message that needs to get out there. That's just one important role of like how language in the upper echelons is in the most important place, the most highest places of power. Language has so much of an effect.
Exactly. And you're asked about the workplace, which interests probably most of our listeners who are young and vital in the workplace. We're now carrying out a research where we're actually trying to find the language that is most practical in order to present an innovation or a new approach or a change at the workplace. So, for example, most of us don't like change. Some love it, but most people don't like change, especially not in the workplace where there's a routine and we feel comfortable in what we know and understand. And when the management comes and says, okay, we're making changes, let's change it. Let's move this there, and you'll do this, and you'll do that. And suddenly there's this chaotic, at least sense. Maybe it's actually going to be more organized, and probably will be, but the workers or the employees, for them it's chaos because it's change, because it's different, because it makes people maybe use up valuable energy in order to digest and accept this change. So through language, you can frame it perhaps differently. You can approach people with a positive, reassuring, calming, accepting language, because you want them to embrace what you're offering them and not to reject it. So what is the language that will actually welcome this change, that will cause the workers or the employees to say, I'm willing to think about it. I'm willing to think about it and at least try to understand it. That's already a step. So we're carrying out this research. We're framing changes in different ways: positive framing versus negative framing, maybe nouns versus verbs. Let's use. That's why I told you about this research beforehand, because maybe it will approach the employees using nouns and less, you want to increase the positive emotions, the level of intensity regarding positive emotions, and you want to decrease the level of intensity regarding negative emotions. So maybe we should be using nouns and not verbs. Maybe we should be using verbs if you want them to act out, if you want to maybe recruit them to do. And so maybe we should be using verbs because then they'll take responsibility. They'll feel that it's more personal, that it has to do with them. These are different ways in which we can use language in order to in the workplace, in order to promote change and so on.
So verbs make someone like own it. It's feel, you can feel it, you can imagine it. When you were talking about conflicts or in the workplace, saying you need to do this big project, it's on you, makes you feel it. But if a noun like this work is here, it needs to be done, that could be taken easier. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, yeah, well, you have to
Can I
think
give an
of it
example?
yeah, you have to think of a better example. If it needs to be done is also it's also a verb. But it's in the passive form, and you're right. Intuitively, Jason, you're right. The passive form, by definition, is less active, right? So the idea is, I think what I'm trying to say here is that depending on the purpose of your story, depending on what you want to achieve as a manager, for example, or what you want to achieve as an employee, depending on the purpose, depending on the context, depending, of course, on, who are the people here at play. Is it a manager versus an employee? Are we talking about two employees? Are we talking about two managers? All this makes a difference, female versus male, etc. There's so many factors at play. But definitely, I think the point I'm trying to make is language is important. Subtleties are not to be taken lightly. Subtle differences in language that people may say, what are you talking about? Noun versus verb. It means exactly the same. No one even notices. Apparently, our brain does. Apparently, our brain notices. Apparently, our brain reacts according to subtle triggers, which which manifest themselves in language.
I love that. And just to be going out in the world and being more aware of the language that we use around us, so that we mentioned before that we can show up and be more positive and be a positive energy. I know that the people that I love to, hang out with and spend time with are people that raise the energy of the room, people that are more positive, people that are bringing people up. And that is all done through language. And I remember in our class as well that you were very good at doing that, raising the energy of the room and making a positive vibe and coming with, this is something that we need to learn. When we first learned about psycholinguistics, I had no clue what that was. And you had the ability using language and using all these tools to make it interesting, to make it engaging, to make something that you would think would be dry actually fun.
I'm glad. I'm very happy.
Yeah.
Good.
Well,
so
you go.
I would say the take-home message is there are a few, right? One is study languages at any age, and two is if and when you choose to have children, then don't be afraid of talking two languages if it's a bilingual setting. Obviously, you don't want to you only want to do it if it's a natural process. And three, pay attention. Pay attention to the words that you use, not only in dialogue with yourself, but especially, or not the same level of importance, the words that you use when you're talking to other people, and even the subtle differences. And always think about what you want to, in a good way, of course, what you want to achieve from this dialogue or from this discourse. And I'm only talking about positive goals. We're not talking about negative ones. We
Mm.
clearly could use language, you could use language also in order to promote negative results, but we're not into that.
Yeah, we're all about positivity and becoming top achievers. And that's actually a great place to wrap up over here because you've given us a lot of useful tips and advice over here. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast here to give me and the listeners just some very valuable information. Uh, if anybody wants to reach out to you or read some more of your work, Professor Orly Idan, where can we find you?
So first of all, there are these academic databases and ResearchGate. But I think that I'm happy to Jason will will write my mail down, and anyone who wants to contact me is more than welcome. I'm very happy to answer and send my articles and other people's articles, of course.
Amazing. And thank you so much again for being on the show. And thank you again to IDC, the Interdisciplinary Centre, for having this connection. I think it's, again, just so amazing. After more than a year of school, I still have connections to professors there. And I'm really grateful for my studies there. Thank you
Wonderful,
again.
wonderful. Thank you,
And
Jason.
best of luck for the new year and the new students.
Thank you. Good
Thank you.
luck to everyone and be healthy.
Thank you. And